So the space economy is projected to skyrocket to, they say, 1.8 trillion by 2035, and that's according to the World Economic Forum and McKinsey and Company. And with me is Kelli Kedis-Ogborn. She's the Vice President of Space and Commerce at the Space Foundation. And Kelly, welcome to National Security News.
No, thank you. It's an honor to be with you today, and I look forward to our discussion.
So that's an economy that's going to skyrocket. So how much of this pie or this cake is taken up by the emerging nations, if you can call it the emerging spacefaring nations?
Yeah, it's a great question because, as an industry and as an ecosystem, we always say that there's never been a better time to become part of the global space ecosystem. And the reason for that is because of the opportunity financially and the increased access. But how you engage and what that means for your country in terms of taking up part of the pie is slightly varied. So if you look at just the space economy, quantifying the numbers of it, we are conservatively estimating that it's going to be close to 772 billion by the year 2027. So your projection that you see of this between 1 to 4 trillion, we actually think we might hit it much sooner. And what's interesting about those numbers is that it's generally made up of about 22% global government spending and 78% commercial revenue. So how these entities engage globally depends on what part of the value chain that you actually engage with, because the actual space market is made up by both upstream and downstream engagement. So when you look at upstream, that's about 1/3 of that 78% of commercial revenue. And that really touches upon things like the design, development, manufacture, launch of space assets. So it's things that you would traditionally think like space propulsion, satellite manufacturing. The insurance industry is also part of that, ground infrastructure, anything of that nature. This market attracts a lot of interest. It's extremely capital intensive because it's what we are thinking about building out our collective vision for the future. But it's also really high risk, high reward. So you're going to get a lot of value, but it's going to take a lot more time to kind of make up that deficit gap. On the other end of the spectrum, it's the downstream, and that's about 2/3 of this commercial market. And that's looking at the utilization of space-based assets for products and services on Earth. So this is things like precision navigation and timing, so GPS, financial transactions, telecommunication, broadband, and Earth observation. And so this downstream is where a lot of these emerging nations play now. Because if you think about the digitization of a lot of these economies, they're engaging with space and satellite tech and satellite data every day. And so what's interesting about that piece is that a lot of these countries don't necessarily realize that they already have industries that are part of space and they're implicated in part of the space ecosystem. So for a lot of them, it's not really starting from scratch. It's just building out the ecosystem in a cohesive way.
So was that what Space Foundation does? Make them aware of that they are actually part of the space economy already?
So that's what my department does. So Space Foundation as an entity has been around for 40 years. We're an education nonprofit headquartered in Colorado Springs. I'm in the Washington, D.C. office. And what we do as an organization is we like to say that we serve everyone from elementary to emeritus. So on one side of the house, we have an annual space symposium. We just concluded our 39th 2 weeks ago in Colorado Springs. And really that brings together the global space ecosystem, everything from academia, national security, civil, commercial, to really convene and discuss the policies and business issues driving the day. On the other side of the house, we have really robust K-12 education, because we believe that space begins in the classroom, because as we talk about the talent pipeline and really being able to scale and sustain the economy, you don't need people to self-select out. We need everybody to know that their background, skill set, and interest is part of space. My department's in the middle. So I run a department I launched 2 years ago called Space Commerce Institute, and we focus on growth into and growth within the space economy. So just like you said, what we do is I make space make sense for people. So it's really being able to qualify and quantify what are the market drivers, what are the technology trends, what industries are implicated. And a big component of that for me is this concept I call space adjacency, of getting these industries that might not believe that they are part of space to realize that they are part of the scalability and the sustainment from an ecosystem capacity, and getting them to spin in, or at least pay attention on how their strategies can influence growth.
So what did you take from the sessions that you've been in today from the Space Forum?
So they were fascinating. I think for me, what I loved about this conference is it was a very different mix of the types of opinions and topics that you generally see. And really what it comes down to is when I look at the engagement with space and all the different types of actors engaging in space, because we're now coming into a reality where it is truly global. Like there are over 80 plus global government space agencies and new space offices we see cropping up all the time. There's already 91 countries actively that have a satellite in orbit. So space is impacting and touching many facets, but when you engage with space, there is this mix of science and space exploration, so on the civil side, national security concerns, and then also commercial space. And so that convergence of those three spheres is really interesting, and it's very much what's going to drive a lot of these future conversations. So for here, I think it was important to touch upon a lot of those points, right? Like regulatory frameworks and how, you know, friends and foes can engage in the area, and also how you can create ecosystems and environments that don't stifle innovation, but allow it to still progress the way it needs to progress without actually, you know, cutting it off at the heels and letting one company kind of monopolize everything.
Well, we're sitting in the seat of power in the United States at the moment. So what is the role of powerful nations like this in enabling other nations or emerging nations or even just people on the way up to become part of this space economy?
I think it's access and awareness, and I think also setting an example. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about where we are rooted in space now is we are really bookended by this Apollo era and the era of Artemis, which have very different flavors to the way that space is engaged. So when you look about how space even started, it obviously was a space race between the United States and the USSR. And at that time, the way that space was engaged is that it was national posturing first, and then scientific exploration and technical advancement kind of came secondary and tertiary. And there was a good reason to that, right? Now that is not the case. I mean, we are now moving into an environment where in order to scale and succeed, it has to be global and it has to be iterative. And so you almost see the model flipped where posturing still exists in some capacity, but you're looking now more toward technical maturity and business cases and sustainment. I mean, we're returning to the moon, but not just to do it. We're actually returning to the moon to stay and to do research and to build infrastructure and use it as future launch points to other orbits and other planets, quite frankly. And so I think that approach is important because it does bring other people to the table. You have to bring best practices and you have to bring capabilities from others. And especially as we build out not just the exploration side, but low Earth orbit with commercial space stations coming online, that's going to give access to people that truly didn't have access before. And so just the ability that this infrastructure exists as a flag and a cornerstone, I think is really going to be exciting to get people to understand that if they don't have a space strategy, they need to have a space strategy and really understand how space can make sense for them.
Well, to make sense of it, can you give us an example of something really exciting you've come across?
Ooh, it can be anything.
Yeah.
So I will say what I find the most exciting, and it's also really near-term implications, is being able to utilize the conditions of space for manufacturing and for healthcare. So there's been a couple of case studies that have already happened on the International Space Station where they've been able to advance an osteoporosis treatment because of the lack of gravity and with radiation, and we're actually able to fast track it through the FDA. Or there was another company that was able to manufacture a retina with size and sophistication that you wouldn't be able to get on Earth. And so I think that the conditions from a supply chain aspect and what it's going to mean for the medical community and pharmaceuticals is going to be really exponential in the next 5 to 7 years. And I find that really exciting because that's going to have such tremendous impact, not just to daily human lives, but so many other industries here on Earth.
Is there any application that you can think of that is not only for advancing science or advancing medicine, but it's just that's something that a woman or a man might want?
So wine. So, and I use this as like a funny example, but it's true. So there was a company in Bordeaux, France, who sent a case of 6 bottles of red wine to the International Space Station to mature for a year because they wanted to be able to test if the lack of microgravity and, you know, the radiation levels and all the things in that condition would have on the bottles of wine. And so they brought them back down. They did a taste test comparison to both. They had very different taste profiles, but the wine actually was good. And now those are selling for, I think, like $1 million a bottle on Christie's. So not like an everyday citizen type thing, but that type of stuff could also eventually lower the cost. And so there's a lot of just really fun ways to engage in space. I think more and more where we're going to find the applications for humans is really on the data side. So if you look about the benefits that just satellite data has now, I mean, for streaming services or the fact that we can, you know, pick up our phone and see someone else's face is like truly amazing. But there's going to be so much data and it's going to be so ubiquitous that I don't even think that we know what to do with it yet. So just to give you some numbers, because I find it fascinating, like currently right now, there's between 8,000 to 9,000 active satellites in orbit. Last year alone, there were 25,000 launched, and there's already over 20,000 licensed for future launch. So just the proliferation of what we are going to be able to capture from imagery and from information is going to be so critical to so many different pieces of infrastructure and industries that I know it's going to transform the way that we engage with technology and engage with each other, but I don't know what that looks like yet.
So what about something like beauty products for women?
Oh yeah, those are tremendous. So I actually personally use a skin cream from a company that's actually a space certified company through the Space Foundation. And what they've been able to do is take certain space technology and create this stem cell skincare that they sell in either like moisturizers or serums. But what's actually really cool about it is they've also used the technology to be able to heal children with second-degree burns. And so it doesn't only have, you know, applications for the pharmaceutical beauty industry, but it's actually had real world impact to other areas where they've been able to heal skin in really new and novel ways.
Wow. Kelli Kedis-Ogborn, thanks so much for speaking to National
Yeah,
Security
thank you for
News.
having me.